Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka stared at the glass bottle in his trembling hands, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The brown liquid inside seemed too rich, too impossible to be real, a sweetness that belonged to childhood memories rather than the harsh reality of prisoner of war camps. Around him in the mess hall of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, dozens of other Japanese prisoners sat in stunned silence, each holding their own bottle of chocolate milk as if it were a precious artifact from another world. "Kore wa nani desu ka?" Tanaka whispered to Corporal Kenji Yamamoto, who sat beside him with tears forming in his eyes. "What is this?" Yamamoto's voice was barely audible. "Chocoreto miruku," chocolate milk. "I had this once as a child in Yokohama before the war, before everything changed. But how can our enemies give us something so kind?" The question hung in the air like incense in a temple, impossible to answer, yet demanding contemplation. The 23-year-old sailor, captured when his destroyer was sunk during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, had expected death or brutal treatment in American captivity. Instead, he found himself holding a symbol of abundance that challenged everything he had been taught about his captor's character and intentions. The decision to serve chocolate milk to Japanese prisoners had not been made lightly by Camp McCoy's administration. Colonel Robert Henderson, the facility's commanding officer, had authorized the purchase after consulting with the camp's medical staff about the psychological impact of small gestures of humanity on prisoners who had arrived in states of severe depression and suicidal ideation. "These men expect to be treated as animals," Dr. Sarah Chen, the camp's psychiatrist, had explained during the staff meeting that led to the chocolate milk program. "They've been conditioned to believe that capture means dishonor worse than death. Something as simple as a sweet drink might help them remember their own humanity while demonstrating ours." The psychological theory behind the gesture was sophisticated, but its implementation was deceptively simple. Each prisoner would receive a bottle of chocolate milk with their evening meal twice a week, along with permission to savor it slowly rather than consuming it immediately. The ritual was designed to create moments of pleasure and reflection that could counteract the despair that plagued Japanese POWs more than any other enemy prisoners. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor, the Irish-American mess sergeant from Boston, whose idea had inspired the program, watched the prisoners' reactions with satisfaction mixed with melancholy. His own son, serving somewhere in the Pacific, might at this moment be facing Japanese soldiers who would never experience such small kindnesses. The irony was not lost on him, but neither was the importance of maintaining American values even in wartime. "Look at their faces," he whispered to Lieutenant Mary Foster, the nurse who had volunteered to observe the prisoners' psychological responses. "Some of them are crying. When was the last time any of us cried over chocolate milk?" The observation was more profound than either realized. For many of the Japanese prisoners, the chocolate milk represented their first taste of sweetness in months, not just literally, but emotionally and spiritually. The stark contrast between their expectations of brutal treatment and the reality of this unexpected kindness created cognitive dissonance that would force them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about American character and intentions. Tanaka raised the bottle to his lips with the reverence typically reserved for sacred sake, his eyes closing as the rich sweetness coated his tongue and awakened memories he had tried to suppress since his capture. He was 7 years old again, walking with his grandfather through the markets of Hiroshima, receiving a precious bottle of imported chocolate milk as a reward for good behavior in school. "Hoji-san," he whispered, using the respectful term for grandfather while addressing the memory rather than any living person. "You told me that sweet things make life worth living, even during difficult times. I thought I would never taste sweetness again." The memory was both blessing and curse, bringing comfort while highlighting the vast distance between his childhood innocence and his current circumstances. The chocolate milk had unlocked emotions that military discipline had taught him to suppress, creating vulnerability that was simultaneously healing and terrifying. Across the mess hall, Private Ichiro Sato struggled with different emotions as he examined the bottle's label with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. The English words, "Fresh Dairy Farms Chocolate Milk," seemed to represent a world of abundance that contradicted everything he had been taught about American society during his military indoctrination. "How can they have so much that they give luxury items to prisoners?" he murmured to himself, his voice filled with wonder and confusion. We were told that America was a nation of weakness and scarcity, yet they treat their enemies better than our own officers treated us. The observation reflected growing awareness among the prisoners that their understanding of America and Americans might be fundamentally flawed. The cognitive dissonance created by experiencing unexpected kindness from supposed barbarians was forcing them to question not just military propaganda, but their entire framework for understanding the conflict and its meaning. Corporal Yamamoto found himself unable to drink his chocolate milk immediately, instead holding it while memories flooded back of his mother, preparing special treats for celebrations and festivals. The sweetness represented not just flavor but love, care, and the kind of domestic tranquility that war had destroyed. His hands shook as he finally raised the bottle to his lips. The first sip triggered an involuntary sob that embarrassed him deeply, but he was not alone. Throughout the mess hall, proud Imperial Navy and Army personnel were experiencing emotional breakthroughs that years of military conditioning had trained them to suppress. The chocolate milk had become a key that unlocked humanity they had learned to hide even from themselves. Dr. Chen moved quietly among the prisoners, observing their reactions while being careful not to intrude on what were clearly profound personal moments. Her clinical training helped her recognize the therapeutic value of what was occurring, but her own humanity was moved by the sight of hardened warriors reduced to tears by simple kindness. "The chocolate milk is working exactly as we hoped," she would write in her report that evening. "The prisoners are experiencing positive emotions many thought they would never feel again. More importantly, they are beginning to see Americans as human beings capable of compassion rather than demons worthy only of hatred." The letters that prisoners were permitted to write to their families in Japan, subject to military censorship, began to include references to the chocolate milk that would profoundly impact Japanese understanding of American character and treatment of prisoners. These communications, while carefully monitored, were allowed to convey the emotional reality of the prisoners' experiences. Tanaka's letter to his mother, written 3 days after his first chocolate milk, captured the confusion and wonder that many prisoners were experiencing. "Honorable Mother, the Americans have given us a sweet drink that reminds me of childhood happiness. I do not understand why our enemies show such kindness, but I cannot deny that it brings comfort to my troubled spirit. Perhaps there are things about this war that we do not fully understand." The carefully diplomatic language concealed profound challenges to everything Tanaka had been taught about American character and intentions. The chocolate milk had created doubt about enemy propaganda that would gradually expand to encompass broader questions about the war's nature and purpose. The psychological impact of the chocolate milk extended beyond individual emotional responses to influence group dynamics within the prisoner population. Men who had maintained stoic military discipline began to share memories of home, family, and peacetime pleasures that created bonds of common humanity, transcending military hierarchy. The evening ritual of chocolate milk consumption had evolved into informal discussion sessions where prisoners talked about their childhoods, families, and hopes for the future. Conversations that would have been impossible under the rigid military discipline that had governed their previous relationships. The sweetness was melting more than taste buds. It was dissolving barriers between men who had learned to hide their vulnerability even from each other. Sergeant O'Connor had begun to look forward to these moments as much as the prisoners did, finding unexpected satisfaction in providing small comforts to men who had been taught to view Americans as inhuman enemies. His own Irish Catholic upbringing had instilled values about treating even enemies with basic human dignity, and the chocolate milk program allowed him to express those values in practical ways. "My mother always said that you can learn everything you need to know about people by watching how they treat those who can't fight back," he confided to Lieutenant Foster during one of their evening observations. "These boys are somebody's sons too, even if their government sent them to kill our boys." The observation reflected broader questions about humanity and warfare that the chocolate milk program had inadvertently raised. The simple gesture of providing a sweet drink was forcing both prisoners and guards to confront the human dimensions of international conflict in ways that formal military protocols could never address. As autumn turned to winter in 1943, the chocolate milk had become the most anticipated event in the prisoners' daily routine. The twice-weekly distribution created moments of joy that sustained morale through the psychological challenges of captivity, while gradually building trust between prisoners, and their American captors. The success of the program had attracted attention from other POW camps, seeking effective methods for managing Japanese prisoners, whose cultural conditioning made them particularly vulnerable to despair and self-destruction. The simple intervention of providing chocolate milk was achieving better results than complex psychological treatments in maintaining prisoner mental health and cooperation. The bottles themselves had become treasured possessions that prisoners carefully cleaned and saved, creating informal shrines in their barracks where empty chocolate milk bottles served as reminders of American kindness and symbols of hope for eventual return to families and normal life. The physical objects had acquired emotional significance that transcended their practical function. Dr. Chen's psychological assessments documented remarkable improvements in prisoner morale and mental health that coincided with the introduction of chocolate milk. Rates of suicide attempts, self-harm incidents, and violent confrontations had decreased dramatically, while cooperation with camp routines and participation in recreational activities had increased substantially. The chocolate milk program has achieved psychological breakthroughs that conventional therapeutic interventions could never have accomplished, she wrote in her quarterly report to military medical authorities. The combination of unexpected kindness, sensory pleasure, and childhood associations has created positive emotional experiences that are rebuilding these men's capacity for hope and human connection. The success of such a simple intervention would influence American policies toward prisoner treatment throughout the remainder of the war, demonstrating that small gestures of humanity could achieve strategic objectives while upholding democratic values. The chocolate milk had become more than refreshment. It was diplomacy in a bottle, sweetening relationships between enemies while planting seeds of understanding that would prove valuable for post-war reconciliation. The harsh Wisconsin winter of 1943 brought more than snow and bitter cold to Camp McCoy. It brought a deepening appreciation for the small warmth that chocolate milk provided to Japanese prisoners whose spirits had been as frozen as the landscape around them. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka sat in the barracks common room, carefully warming his twice-weekly bottle between his palms while snow fell outside the windows, each sip transporting him further from the reality of captivity toward memories of a childhood that seemed to belong to another person entirely. "The chocolate milk tastes different when it's cold outside," he observed to Corporal Yamamoto, who had become his closest friend during their months of captivity. "Sweeter somehow, more precious. Like the warmth goes deeper than just your mouth and stomach." Yamamoto nodded thoughtfully, his own bottle held with the reverence typically reserved for ceremonial objects. "It reminds me of winter evenings at home, when my mother would prepare hot, sweet drinks for the family. But this is different. It comes from our enemies, yet it feels like love." The paradox that Yamamoto identified had become central to the prisoners' psychological transformation during their captivity. The cognitive dissonance between expected brutality and experienced kindness was forcing fundamental re-evaluation of assumptions about American character and the nature of the conflict they had been fighting. Dr. Sarah Chen had been documenting the long-term psychological effects of the chocolate milk program through detailed interviews with prisoners who volunteered to discuss their emotional responses. Her research was revealing profound changes in attitude and worldview that extended far beyond simple gratitude for better treatment. The chocolate milk has become a symbol that encompasses multiple layers of meaning for these men, she wrote in her expanded analysis. It represents childhood innocence, maternal care, unexpected kindness from enemies, and hope for eventual reconciliation with normal human emotions. Each bottle consumed creates positive associations that gradually replace negative conditioning about American intentions. The therapeutic value of the program had exceeded all expectations, with prisoners showing measurable improvements in depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. The simple intervention was achieving results that complex medical treatments had failed to produce, suggesting that emotional healing required human connection rather than clinical expertise. The letters that prisoners wrote to their families had evolved to include increasingly detailed descriptions of American kindness, with chocolate milk serving as tangible evidence that challenged Japanese propaganda about enemy brutality. These communications were gradually influencing Japanese understanding of American character, while providing comfort to families worried about their captured loved ones. Tanaka's correspondence with his younger sister had become particularly detailed about the emotional impact of chocolate milk. "Sweet Hanako, today I received chocolate milk again, and with each sip, I remembered the treats you and I shared during festival days. The Americans who give us this sweetness cannot be the demons our officers described. Perhaps there are good people on both sides of this terrible war." The letter represented significant evolution in Tanaka's thinking about the conflict and its participants. The chocolate milk had created space for nuanced understanding that military indoctrination had trained him to reject, allowing recognition of enemy humanity that could coexist with loyalty to his own country. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor had begun to view the chocolate milk distribution as the most meaningful part of his daily duties, finding unexpected satisfaction in providing comfort to men who had been taught to view Americans as monsters. His observations of prisoner responses had convinced him that small gestures of kindness could achieve more than harsh discipline in managing enemy personnel. "You should see how they hold those bottles," he told his wife in one of his weekly letters home. "Like they're holding something sacred. It makes me think about our boys over there. I hope somebody's showing them the same kind of human decency if they get captured." The empathy that the chocolate milk program had generated between guards and prisoners was creating bonds of mutual understanding that transcended official military relationships. American personnel were beginning to see Japanese prisoners as individuals with families, hopes, and emotions, rather than faceless representatives of an enemy ideology. The winter months had provided opportunities for more intimate conversations between prisoners and guards during chocolate milk distribution, as the shared experience of cold weather and warm drinks created natural occasions for human connection. These interactions were gradually breaking down barriers of language, culture, and political allegiance. Lieutenant Mary Foster had begun learning basic Japanese phrases so she could communicate more effectively with prisoners during medical examinations, often using chocolate milk as a conversation starter that put nervous patients at ease. Her efforts to connect across language barriers were appreciated by prisoners who had expected linguistic isolation during their captivity. "Oishi desuka?" she would ask, inquiring whether the chocolate milk tasted good while examining prisoners for signs of illness or injury. The simple question in their native language, combined with concern for their comfort and enjoyment, created moments of human connection that facilitated better medical care while building trust. The chocolate milk had also become a vehicle for cultural exchange, as prisoners began to share information about Japanese sweets and drinks with American personnel who expressed curiosity about their culinary traditions. These conversations created opportunities for mutual learning that challenged stereotypes on both sides. Private Ichiro Sato had become the unofficial expert on comparative confections, spending hours explaining to interested guards the differences between American chocolate milk and Japanese sweet treats like shiruko, sweet red bean soup, and amazake, sweet rice drink. His detailed descriptions of Japanese festival foods had given American personnel insights into enemy culture that formal intelligence briefings could never provide. "In Japan, we have many sweet drinks, but they are usually served hot and made from rice or beans," he explained to Sergeant O'Connor during one of their conversations. "Your chocolate milk is different, cold, and made from cow's milk with chocolate. But the feeling it gives is the same: comfort, happiness, memories of better times." The cross-cultural comparison had helped both prisoners and guards recognize common human needs and experiences that transcended national boundaries and political conflicts. The chocolate milk was creating bridges of understanding that could facilitate post-war reconciliation between former enemies. The spring of 1944 brought news from the Pacific Theater that made the chocolate milk even more precious to prisoners who were beginning to understand that Japan's military position was deteriorating rapidly. The sweetness provided emotional comfort during a period when external developments were creating psychological stress about the war's eventual outcome. The psychological coping mechanisms that prisoners had developed around chocolate milk consumption became more elaborate as external pressures increased. Some had created rituals around drinking their allotted bottles, while others had begun sharing portions with fellow prisoners who were struggling with depression or homesickness. Corporal Yamamoto had established a practice of saving half his chocolate milk to share with younger prisoners who reminded him of his own son back in Japan. The gesture created informal family structures within the prisoner community that provided emotional support while demonstrating values of care and protection that transcended individual self-interest. "When I share my chocolate milk with Sato-kun," he explained to Dr. Chen during one of their counseling sessions, "I remember what it feels like to be a father rather than just a prisoner. The sweetness is better when it's shared with someone who needs comfort." The observation reflected profound psychological healing that was occurring through the simple medium of a sweet drink. The chocolate milk was not just providing comfort, but restoring prisoners' sense of identity and purpose beyond their military roles and current circumstances. The bottles themselves had become objects of artistic expression as prisoners with artistic skills began decorating empty containers with drawings and poems that reflected their emotional responses to American kindness. These impromptu artworks served as visual records of psychological transformation, while providing creative outlets for men whose previous lives had offered little opportunity for artistic expression. Tanaka had begun sketching scenes from his childhood on chocolate milk bottles, creating a visual diary that connected past happiness with present hope. His drawings of family festivals, school celebrations, and peaceful village life served as reminders of the normal world that existed beyond military conflict and prisoner camps. "When I draw on these bottles," he told fellow prisoners during one of their evening discussions, "I remember who I was before I became a soldier. The chocolate milk helps me believe I can be that person again someday." The artistic activities inspired by chocolate milk had attracted attention from American personnel who recognized their therapeutic value for prisoner mental health. The creative expression was providing emotional outlets that formal recreational programs had failed to achieve, suggesting that healing required personal meaning-making rather than structured activities. The success of the chocolate milk program had influenced American policies toward prisoner treatment at other facilities, with similar programs being implemented at camps throughout the United States. The demonstration that small gestures of kindness could achieve significant psychological benefits was changing military understanding of effective prisoner management. The documentation that Dr. Chen was compiling about the program's effects would eventually influence post-war approaches to trauma treatment and cross-cultural understanding. Her systematic observation of how simple pleasures could rebuild human capacity for hope and connection provided insights that would prove valuable for healing societies damaged by total war. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the chocolate milk had evolved from unexpected luxury to essential element of prisoner life at Camp McCoy. The twice-weekly distribution had created rhythms of anticipation and satisfaction that provided structure and meaning to lives that had been stripped of purpose and direction through military defeat and captivity. The relationships that had developed between prisoners and American personnel through the medium of chocolate milk were creating foundations for mutual respect and understanding that would prove valuable for post-war reconciliation efforts. The sweetness shared between former enemies was planting seeds of peace that would grow long after the military conflict ended. The summer of 1944 brought with it the weight of inevitable defeat, as news from the Pacific Theater reached Camp McCoy and the Japanese prisoners began to understand that their homeland was facing catastrophic military collapse. Yet paradoxically, it was during this darkest period that the chocolate milk program achieved its most profound psychological impact, providing emotional sustenance that helped men maintain their humanity while confronting the destruction of everything they had fought to protect. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka stood in the mess hall on a humid July evening, holding his chocolate milk while tears streamed down his face, not from shame at his capture, but from overwhelming gratitude for kindness that seemed to expand rather than diminish as his country's prospects grew darker. The American guards who had watched him transform from suicidal despair to cautious hope now represented something he had never expected to find in enemy hands: genuine care for his welfare as a human being. "Watashi wa ningen da," he whispered to himself while savoring the familiar sweetness. "I am human. Despite everything, I am still human." The affirmation represented a fundamental breakthrough in psychological healing that had taken months of chocolate milk, conversations, and small gestures of kindness to achieve. Tanaka's recognition of his own humanity, despite military conditioning that had taught him capture meant spiritual death, marked a transformation that extended far beyond individual recovery to encompass broader questions about identity, dignity, and the possibility of redemption. Dr. Sarah Chen had been documenting the evolution of prisoner psychology through the lens of their relationship with chocolate milk, recognizing that their emotional responses to this simple pleasure reflected deeper changes in their understanding of themselves and their captors. Her research was revealing insights into human resilience and the power of kindness that would influence therapeutic approaches for decades. "The chocolate milk has become more than food or comfort," she wrote in her comprehensive summer assessment. "It has become a symbol of the prisoners' reconnection with their own humanity and their growing recognition that their enemies possess human qualities worthy of respect. This transformation is preparing them for reintegration into civilian life while creating foundations for post-war reconciliation." The psychological preparation for peace that was occurring through such simple means had not been anticipated by military planners, yet it was achieving results that complex political negotiations might never accomplish. The bonds being formed between former enemies through shared appreciation of chocolate milk were creating personal relationships that could transcend national boundaries and political conflicts. Corporal Kenji Yamamoto had begun using chocolate milk as a lens for understanding the broader implications of Japan's defeat and the necessity of building different relationships with the world community. His observations about American character, informed by months of experiencing unexpected kindness, were influencing his thinking about post-war reconstruction and international cooperation. "The Americans who give us chocolate milk cannot be the same people who bomb our cities," he confided to Tanaka during one of their evening conversations. "Yet they are the same people. This means that enemies can also be potential friends, depending on circumstances and choices. Perhaps Japan's future lies not in continued hostility, but in learning from those who defeated us." The insight represented sophisticated understanding of international relations that military training had never provided. The chocolate milk had created space for nuanced thinking about conflict and cooperation that could prove valuable for Japan's eventual integration into the post-war international community. The letters that prisoners continued to write to their families had evolved to include systematic discussions of American character and society based on their daily experiences with kindness and respect. These communications were gradually influencing Japanese understanding of their former enemies, while providing emotional comfort to families struggling with defeat and occupation. Tanaka's correspondence with his mother had become particularly detailed about the philosophical implications of chocolate milk. "Honored Mother, each bottle of chocolate milk I receive contains more than sweetness. It contains evidence that our enemies possess hearts capable of compassion. If Americans can show kindness to prisoners who fought against them, perhaps there is hope for building peaceful relationships after this terrible war ends." The letter represented significant evolution in thinking about international relations and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. The chocolate milk had created cognitive frameworks for understanding how forgiveness and cooperation might be possible despite the devastation of total war. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor had begun to see the chocolate milk distribution as preparation for his own post-war adjustment, recognizing that his ability to show kindness to enemy prisoners was helping him maintain his own humanity despite the dehumanizing effects of military conflict. The program was providing psychological benefits for American personnel as well as Japanese prisoners. "Giving those boys chocolate milk keeps me connected to who I was before the war and who I want to be after it ends," he explained to Lieutenant Foster during one of their supervisory discussions. "It's easy to lose yourself in hatred when you're fighting, but these small gestures of kindness remind me that we're all human beings first." The observation reflected broader questions about maintaining moral identity during warfare that the chocolate milk program had inadvertently addressed. The simple act of providing comfort to enemy prisoners was helping American personnel preserve democratic values while participating in necessary military action. The autumn of 1944 brought news of American military advances that made Japanese defeat inevitable. Yet rather than creating despair among the prisoners, these developments seemed to increase their appreciation for the kindness they were receiving. The contrast between their expectations of brutal treatment and the reality of chocolate milk had created emotional resilience that sustained them through acknowledgement of military catastrophe. Private Ichiro Sato had begun to view chocolate milk as a form of spiritual communion that connected him with universal human experiences of comfort, care, and hope. His philosophical reflections on the meaning of sweetness in the midst of suffering were providing insights that helped other prisoners cope with the psychological challenges of defeat and captivity. "When I drink chocolate milk," he explained to fellow prisoners during one of their informal discussion groups, "I taste not just flavor, but the possibility that human beings can choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. Perhaps this is what we are supposed to learn from our enemies." The theological implications of receiving grace from opponents were creating opportunities for spiritual growth that military chaplains had been unable to facilitate through conventional religious instruction. The chocolate milk was becoming a sacrament of human dignity that transcended denominational boundaries while providing comfort during existential crisis. The artistic expression that had emerged around chocolate milk consumption had evolved into a sophisticated form of cultural commentary that reflected prisoners' changing understanding of their place in the world. The poems, drawings, and stories created on empty bottles served as records of psychological transformation while providing creative outlets for processing traumatic experiences. Tanaka's poetry, written on chocolate milk bottles and shared among fellow prisoners, captured the paradoxes of finding sweetness in captivity. Enemy hands offer sweetness, while friendly hands once offered only steel. In this upside-down world, perhaps up is down, and down leads to understanding. The verses reflected sophisticated grappling with questions of loyalty, identity, and moral complexity that military training had discouraged. The chocolate milk was providing space for intellectual and emotional development that could prove valuable for post-war reconstruction of Japanese society. The winter of 1944-1945 brought the most severe psychological test yet for prisoners who were beginning to receive detailed information about the devastation being visited upon their homeland by American bombing campaigns. The cognitive dissonance between receiving kindness from people whose military was destroying Japan created emotional challenges that required all the psychological resources the prisoners had developed. The chocolate milk became even more precious during this period, serving as tangible evidence that Americans possessed moral complexity that transcended simple categories of friend and enemy. The sweetness provided emotional anchor during a period when external developments threatened to overwhelm the psychological stability that months of humane treatment had built. Dr. Chen's observations during this critical period revealed the chocolate milk's role in maintaining prisoner mental health despite devastating news from home. The emotional associations that prisoners have built around chocolate milk are providing psychological protection against despair that might otherwise prove overwhelming. Their ability to experience pleasure and human connection through this simple medium is sustaining hope for eventual rebuilding of normal life. The therapeutic function that chocolate milk was serving during Japan's darkest hour demonstrated the power of small gestures to maintain human dignity and psychological resilience under extreme circumstances. The program was providing evidence that kindness could serve strategic purposes, while upholding moral principles that distinguished democratic societies from their totalitarian opponents. The relationships that had developed between prisoners and American personnel through the medium of chocolate milk were deepening into genuine friendships that transcended official military roles. These personal connections were creating networks of understanding that could facilitate post-war cooperation between former enemies. Sergeant O'Connor's daily conversations with prisoners during chocolate milk distribution had evolved into cultural exchanges that provided mutual education about American and Japanese values, traditions, and hopes for the future. These interactions were creating foundations for international understanding that formal diplomatic efforts might never achieve. "These boys have taught me more about Japan and Japanese people than any intelligence briefing ever did," he wrote to his wife in February 1945. "They're not the fanatics we were told to expect. They're farmers and shopkeepers and students who got caught up in something bigger than themselves." The chocolate milk helps us all remember that we're fighting systems, not people. The insight would prove prophetic for post-war American policies toward Japan, as the recognition of shared humanity developed through programs like chocolate milk distribution would influence approaches to occupation and reconstruction that emphasized rehabilitation rather than punishment. As spring approached in 1945, bringing with it the prospect of final victory and eventual repatriation. The prisoners at Camp McCoy faced the complex challenge of maintaining psychological gains they had achieved while preparing to return to a homeland that would bear little resemblance to the country they had left. The chocolate milk had become a symbol of possibility that could sustain them through the difficult transitions ahead. The knowledge and relationships they had gained through this simplest of pleasures would prove valuable for Japan's post-war development, as former prisoners carried with them understanding of American character and democratic values that could facilitate peaceful cooperation. The sweetness shared between enemies had planted seeds of friendship that would grow long after the military conflict ended. The spring of 1945 brought with it the bittersweet reality of Japan's surrender and the approaching end of a captivity that had transformed Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka from a despairing soldier into a man who had rediscovered his capacity for hope, gratitude, and human connection. Standing in the Camp McCoy mess hall for what might be his final chocolate milk distribution, he found himself overwhelmed, not by sadness at leaving, but by profound appreciation for the kindness that had saved his life in ways that transcended mere physical survival. "Arigato gozaimasu," he said to Staff Sergeant Mike O'Connor, using formal Japanese to express gratitude that English words seemed inadequate to convey. "Thank you for showing me that sweetness can exist, even in the darkest times. I will carry this memory with me forever." O'Connor's response, delivered in the broken Japanese he had learned through months of interaction with the prisoners, was equally emotional. "Tanaka-san, you taught me that our enemies are also human beings with families and feelings. The chocolate milk was just milk. The real sweetness was discovering our shared humanity." The exchange represented more than polite farewell between former enemies. It embodied the transformation that had occurred through the simple medium of a sweet drink that had unlocked emotions, memories, and possibilities that military conflict had seemed to destroy. The relationships forged through chocolate milk would endure long after the political circumstances that created them had passed into history. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent the final months of the war documenting the long-term psychological impact of the chocolate milk program, recognizing that the prisoners' transformation represented more than successful rehabilitation. It provided a model for healing societies damaged by total war through recognition of shared humanity rather than perpetuation of hatred. The chocolate milk program has achieved unprecedented success in maintaining prisoner mental health while creating foundations for post-war reconciliation, she wrote in her comprehensive final assessment. The simple gesture of providing sweetness to men who expected brutality has produced psychological changes that will influence not only individual lives, but broader patterns of international cooperation and understanding. The research would influence American policies toward occupied Japan, where former prisoners who had experienced unexpected kindness would serve as bridges between cultures that had been separated by years of propaganda and violence. Their testimony about American character would prove valuable for building trust during the challenging period of Reconstruction and democratic reform. The repatriation process that began in late 1945 created opportunities for Japanese prisoners to carry their transformed understanding of American character back to a homeland that would need to rebuild relationships with former enemies while constructing new foundations for international cooperation. The chocolate milk had provided more than comfort. It had offered education in democratic values that could influence Japan's post-war development. Tanaka's return to Hiroshima in October 1945 brought him face-to-face with devastation that challenged his newfound optimism about human nature and the possibility of reconciliation. The atomic bombing had destroyed not only buildings and infrastructure, but also the community networks and cultural institutions that had provided meaning and identity for local residents. Yet his experience with chocolate milk had given him psychological tools for processing trauma and finding hope in seemingly hopeless circumstances. The sweetness he had learned to appreciate during captivity became a metaphor for discovering possibilities for renewal and reconstruction, even in the midst of unprecedented destruction. "The Americans who gave me chocolate milk cannot be the same people who dropped the atomic bomb," he wrote in his first letter to O'Connor after repatriation. Yet they are the same people. This means that human beings are capable of both terrible destruction and remarkable kindness. Perhaps our task is to encourage the kindness while preventing the destruction. The philosophical framework that chocolate milk had helped him develop provided resources for understanding moral complexity that enabled him to work for reconciliation rather than revenge during Japan's Reconstruction period. His testimony about American kindness would influence Japanese attitudes toward the occupation, while his appreciation for democratic values would shape his contributions to post-war society. Corporal Kenji Yamamoto's return to rural Kyushu enabled him to share his chocolate milk experiences with farming communities that had been isolated from direct contact with Americans, but whose cooperation would be essential for successful occupation and reconstruction. His stories about unexpected kindness from former enemies provided evidence that challenged propaganda while building support for democratic reforms. The Americans who shared their chocolate milk with prisoners understand something about human dignity that our military leaders never grasped, he explained to skeptical neighbors who questioned cooperation with occupation forces. They showed us that strength can be combined with compassion, that victory need not require humiliation of the defeated. His advocacy for cooperation with American occupation authorities drew directly from lessons learned through chocolate milk about the possibility of building trust between former enemies through mutual recognition of shared humanity. The sweetness had taught him that reconciliation was possible when both sides chose understanding over hatred. The correspondence that continued between former prisoners and American personnel created ongoing channels for cultural exchange that facilitated Japan's integration into the post-war international community. These personal relationships provided foundations for broader cooperation that formal diplomatic efforts alone could never have achieved. O'Connor's letters to Tanaka, which continued throughout the occupation period, provided ongoing encouragement for democratic reforms while demonstrating continued American interest in Japanese welfare and development. The friendship that had begun through chocolate milk distribution became a symbol of possibilities for international cooperation based on mutual respect and understanding. I hope Japan can rebuild in ways that create opportunity and happiness for all its people, O'Connor wrote in one of his regular letters. The country that produces people like you deserves a future filled with the same sweetness you found in our chocolate milk, sweetness that comes from human kindness rather than artificial flavoring. The metaphor reflected understanding that democratic reconstruction required more than political institutions. It demanded cultural changes that emphasized human dignity and compassion over power and domination. The chocolate milk had provided both men with vocabulary for discussing these complex ideas in personal rather than abstract terms. The businesses that former prisoners established in post-war Japan often reflected values they had learned through their American experiences, with emphasis on employee welfare and community responsibility that drew from observations of democratic society during their captivity. Tanaka's confectionery shop, opened in 1947, specialized in fusion sweets that combined Japanese and American traditions. Every chocolate milk I serve reminds me of the kindness I received as a prisoner, he explained to customers who were curious about his unusual menu selections. Sweet flavors should bring people together rather than divide them. My shop serves friendship along with candy. The business became a gathering place for former soldiers and civilians who were struggling with post-war adjustment, providing community space where people could process traumatic experiences while building hope for the future. The chocolate milk recipes that Tanaka developed drew from his prison camp memories while incorporating traditional Japanese ingredients that honored his heritage. The educational programs that former prisoners organized for Japanese reconstruction personnel drew heavily on their American experiences to demonstrate the practical advantages of treating people with dignity and respect. Yamamoto's work with agricultural cooperatives emphasized the organizational principles he had observed during captivity, where American personnel had achieved remarkable efficiency through voluntary cooperation rather than coercive discipline. The Americans who gave us chocolate milk understood that people work better when they feel valued and respected, he explained to farmers who were learning new agricultural techniques under occupation guidance. Their kindness was not weakness, but strength. It created loyalty and cooperation that harsh treatment could never achieve. The management philosophy reflected understanding of democratic principles that extended far beyond political institutions to encompass fundamental approaches to human relationships and social organization. The chocolate milk had provided practical education in democratic values that influenced former prisoners' contributions to Japan's economic and social reconstruction. The letters that former prisoners wrote to American newspapers and magazines, sharing their experiences of kindness during captivity, provided powerful testimony for American audiences about the effectiveness of humane treatment in achieving strategic objectives while maintaining moral principles. These communications helped build public support for continued assistance to Japan during Reconstruction. Tanaka's letter to the Boston Globe, published in 1947, captured the ongoing impact of chocolate milk on his understanding of international relations. "The sweet drink you shared with your prisoners taught us that Americans possess both the strength to defeat enemies and the wisdom to transform them into friends. Your chocolate milk was more powerful than any weapon because it conquered hatred with kindness." The testimonial provided evidence for arguments about the strategic value of demonstrating democratic values through practical actions rather than mere propaganda. The chocolate milk program had shown that small gestures of humanity could achieve diplomatic objectives while upholding principles that distinguish democratic societies from their totalitarian opponents. The academic studies that eventually emerged from the chocolate milk program documented the psychological mechanisms through which simple pleasures could rebuild human capacity for trust, hope, and social connection after traumatic experiences. Dr. Chen's research became foundational literature for developing therapeutic approaches to trauma treatment that emphasized positive experiences rather than merely addressing negative symptoms. The chocolate milk intervention succeeded because it provided prisoners with concrete evidence that their captors viewed them as human beings worthy of consideration and care, she explained in her post-war publications. This recognition of their fundamental dignity enabled psychological healing that conventional medical treatment could never have achieved. The findings influenced therapeutic approaches to trauma treatment throughout the medical community, while providing evidence for the effectiveness of kindness-based interventions in healing psychological wounds created by warfare and violence. The research established scientific foundations for understanding how simple human connections could overcome even the most severe emotional damage. The international relationships that former prisoners maintained with American personnel from their captivity period continued to influence Japanese-American cooperation throughout the Cold War period. These personal connections created networks of understanding that facilitated political and military cooperation while promoting democratic values and human rights. The peace treaty negotiations between Japan and the United States included several former prisoners who had experienced American kindness during captivity, providing perspectives that influenced both sides' approaches to post-war relationship building. Their testimony about chocolate milk and other gestures of humanity helped create framework for cooperation based on mutual respect rather than victor-vanquished dynamics. The Americans who shared chocolate milk with us proved that former enemies can become genuine allies when they choose understanding over hatred, Yamamoto explained to Japanese negotiators who were developing positions for treaty discussions. Our future security depends on building the same kind of trust and cooperation that began with simple acts of kindness. The diplomatic framework that emerged from these negotiations reflected understanding that sustainable peace required more than formal agreements. It demanded personal relationships and cultural connections that could survive political changes and international tensions. The chocolate milk had provided a model for building such relationships through sustained demonstration of respect and care. The children's education programs that former prisoners developed in post-war Japan often used chocolate milk as a symbol for teaching about international friendship and the importance of treating others with kindness, regardless of their background or nationality. These lessons provided foundations for democratic citizenship that would influence Japanese society for generations. Tanaka's work with elementary schools included storytelling sessions where he shared carefully adapted versions of his prison camp experiences, emphasizing the transformative power of kindness while teaching children about the possibility of finding friendship in unexpected places. The chocolate milk became a recurring symbol in these educational programs. When people from different countries share something sweet together, he would tell his young audiences, They remember that we all enjoy the same simple pleasures, regardless of where we come from or what language we speak. Chocolate milk tastes good to everyone, just like kindness feels good to everyone. The educational approach reflected understanding that democratic values required early cultivation through positive experiences rather than abstract instruction. The chocolate milk stories provided concrete examples of international cooperation that children could understand and apply in their own relationships with others. The businesses that emerged from former prisoners' appreciation for American-style customer service often emphasized the same attention to individual dignity and comfort that had characterized the chocolate milk program. These enterprises contributed to Japan's economic development while demonstrating practical applications of democratic values in commercial relationships. The department stores, restaurants, and service industries established by former prisoners frequently featured American-inspired amenities and policies that emphasized customer satisfaction and employee welfare. The chocolate milk had taught them that treating people well was not only morally correct, but also economically advantageous for building successful enterprises. By 1960, 15 years after the end of the war, the former prisoners who had experienced American chocolate milk during their captivity had become influential advocates for Japanese-American friendship and democratic values throughout Japanese society. Their transformation from enemy soldiers to bridge builders demonstrated the power of simple kindness to change the course of history. The reunions that were organized between former prisoners and American personnel who had supervised them during captivity created powerful symbols of reconciliation that influenced public opinion in both countries. These gatherings often featured ceremonial sharing of chocolate milk that recreated the original experiences while celebrating the friendship that had emerged from former enmity. Tanaka's reunion with Sergeant O'Connor in 1965, 20 years after their last meeting at Camp McCoy, took place at the confectionery shop in Hiroshima, where chocolate milk had become the signature drink. The ceremony attracted international media attention as a symbol of how individual relationships could transcend national conflicts to create lasting peace. "This chocolate milk tastes even sweeter than I remembered," O'Connor told gathered reporters while sharing a drink with his former prisoner. "But the sweetest thing is seeing how Tanaka-san has used his life to build bridges between our countries. That's the real victory that came from showing a little kindness to people who had every reason to hate us." The event provided powerful testimony about the long-term impact of humane treatment on international relations, demonstrating that investments in human dignity during wartime could yield dividends of friendship and cooperation for decades. The chocolate milk had become a symbol of possibilities for transforming conflict into collaboration through sustained commitment to treating others with respect and care. The memoirs that former prisoners published in their later years consistently emphasized the chocolate milk program as a turning point in their understanding of American character and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. These personal accounts provided historical documentation of how small gestures could achieve strategic objectives while upholding moral principles. Yamamoto's autobiography, published in 1970, included an entire chapter devoted to chocolate milk and its role in his psychological transformation. The sweet drink that American guards shared with us contained more than flavor. It contained hope for a world where former enemies could become friends through mutual recognition of shared humanity. Every sip reminded us that kindness was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. The book became required reading in Japanese schools for students studying post-war reconstruction and international relations, providing evidence that democratic values could be transmitted through practical demonstration rather than theoretical instruction. The chocolate milk stories offered concrete examples of how individual actions could influence broader patterns of cooperation and understanding. The legacy of the chocolate milk program extended beyond Japan to influence American policies toward prisoner treatment and post-conflict reconstruction throughout the Cold War and beyond. The documented success of simple humanitarian gestures in achieving both therapeutic and strategic objectives provided models for military and diplomatic personnel facing similar challenges in other conflicts. The training programs that were developed for American military personnel included case studies of the chocolate milk program as examples of how small investments in human dignity could produce significant returns in cooperation and intelligence gathering. These lessons influenced American approaches to prisoner treatment and civilian relations in subsequent conflicts throughout the world. By 1975, 30 years after the end of World War II, the chocolate milk program had become legendary among military historians and psychologists as one of the most successful examples of using kindness as a strategic tool while maintaining ethical principles. The simple intervention had demonstrated that treating enemies with dignity was not only morally correct, but also practically effective for achieving political and military objectives. The International Red Cross adopted principles from the chocolate milk program in developing guidelines for prisoner treatment that emphasize the psychological importance of small comforts and gestures of respect. The documentation provided by Dr. Chen and other researchers established scientific foundations for understanding how humanitarian treatment could serve both moral and strategic purposes. Tanaka's final letter to O'Connor, written shortly before Tanaka's death in 1985, captured the lasting significance of their shared experience. Dear Mike-san, 40 years have passed since you first offered me chocolate milk in that prison camp, but the sweetness remains as strong as ever. You taught me that enemies can become brothers when they choose kindness over hatred. This lesson shaped not only my life, but my country's future. The chocolate milk we shared was more than a drink. It was a sacrament of human dignity that continues to nourish friendship between our peoples. The correspondence represented more than personal gratitude. It embodied recognition that individual acts of kindness could influence the course of history by creating possibilities for cooperation and understanding that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. The chocolate milk had proven that simple human gestures could achieve diplomatic objectives while honoring the dignity and worth of every individual. The monument that was erected in Hiroshima in 1995, 50 years after the atomic bombing, included a bronze plaque honoring the American personnel who had treated Japanese prisoners with kindness during the war. The inscription, suggested by former prisoners, read, "To those who shared sweetness in bitter times," proving that humanity transcends conflict. The chocolate milk bottles carved into the memorial served as eternal reminders that even in warfare, individuals could choose compassion over cruelty. The extraordinary story of Japanese POWs and chocolate milk reveals one of World War II's most touching examples of how simple human kindness could transform enemies into friends. What began as a basic gesture of providing sweet drinks to despairing prisoners became a powerful symbol of American values and human dignity that would influence Japanese-American relations for generations. From the first shocked tears of prisoners who couldn't believe their enemies would show such compassion to the post-war friendships that grew from shared moments of sweetness, the chocolate milk program demonstrated that treating people with dignity was not only morally right but strategically effective. These small bottles of kindness melted hatred and built bridges that would prove more durable than any political treaty. What moved you most about how something as simple as chocolate milk could have such a profound impact on former enemies? Were you surprised by how quickly acts of kindness could transform relationships built on hatred and propaganda? Share your thoughts in the comments about how small gestures of humanity can change hearts and minds. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button for more incredible stories of how individual compassion can alter the course of history.